And indeed, it worked. Nice. So also welcome from my side. I'm the last part in the trio of Königsweg who is here today. And I'm going to speak about a roadmap to being data-driven with data operations today. And I will do so in 3 steps. We're going to start with something introductory. What is DataOps? Why is DataOps really cool? Why do you want to have DataOps? Then we're going to have a look at the second part, how to get started, how to identify potential in your company. And then we're going to spend half of the talk on something practical where we're going to have a look at 2 use cases. So you only need to make it through the first 10 minutes and then we'll have something practical. So without further ado, and not dragging out the theory stuff, Data Operations 101. And for this talk, I wanted to do everything very nice and clean, and I Googled around what's the textbook definition of data operations. And as typical in AI, it seems that there are 100 definitions if you ask 50 people. So I think it's most instructive actually if you think about data operations as the data machine room of your company. You can think of this analog to, let's say, a large cruise ship. You have a machine room that provides power and propulsion to you, but you don't want to have to run down there if you're the captain of the boat and get your hands all dirty every time you need to change course. So you want to have a machine room that takes care of all the technical stuff, and therefore the goal of DataOps is have a dedicated unit ensuring quality and availability of your data. You want to enable people to work with data without bothering them too much with all of the data management hassles. And to stay in the analogy with the cruise ship, not every cruise ship is the same, depending on if you're cruising in the Antarctic or if you're cruising in the tropics. If you have 100 or 6,000 passengers on board, data operations as well needs to be tailored to your specific needs. I've given you the 2 current hype examples, a data mesh and data fabric in very abstract here. With this out of the way, why is DataOps really great? It's great not only because it improves the availability and reliability of the data for the departments working with the data in your organization, but also because if you implement DataOps using open source software, you can establish a vendor-independent way to deal with your data. So you're saving potentially a lot of money by avoiding licensing fees if you're going open source, and you can avoid vendor lock-in, which can be really handy in the long run. You can work at your own pace, prioritize what you need exactly when you need it, and you decide which data goes where, which I guess will be the theme of the third talk. So you might be wondering now, do I need DataOps? And here I brought you something that we're using internally. On the bottom left side, you can see how we as Königsweg are categorizing different companies. And it ranges from data naive to being highly AI optimized, depending on the level of technological improvement in your organization and the level of how important data is to your core business processes. And I've brought you the 6 core things here for being a data-driven company. And you can see you're relying heavily on data insights for decision making, and data analysis and AI are becoming central to core business processes. So you got to make sure that these things work. And that's where data operations is handy. The only problem with all of this is how we come up with the assessment. The whole thing is not exactly straightforward, and that's why we're going to have a look at how to get started in your specific case in the second part of this talk, which I labeled your data treasure map. Because in order to get started with data operations, you need to identify 2 different set of things. The first thing you need to identify is the treasure itself. How much data do you have? Is your data AI relevant? What types of data is prevalent in your organization? How many data points do you have? Have you a history with your data? Like, is it historized? All of these things. And you might be saying now, of course, I know, easy, no problem. And I would contend that if you're working in an organization which is just now moving into being data-driven and is in business for more than 5 years, probably you don't know. That's the funny thing. Usually there is not only significant heterogeneity across departments in data quality and quantity. So if I ask you working in department X, what does department Y have actually in terms of data? You might be surprised But also, there tend to be a lot of silos and what I labeled knowledge hoarders. These tend to be very dedicated people taking care of their silos, guarding it enviously. And as soon as they retire, you realize that they were the only person capable of handling the data in this department specifically. Which brings us neatly to the second thing you need to know, which I labeled your data black market. That's another thing that's just bound to happen if you don't have good data operations in your company and you have been in business for a while. You know, things just happen. Put yourself in the shoes of somebody who needs to make a report. You're asking your colleague from sales, hey, can you give me the newest sales data? He or she sends over an Excel file. You're making the report. Somebody else in sales didn't add their recent sales to the list. You go into the meeting. The report is already outdated 2 days after it's been made. Nobody can trace the error. Nobody knows what's going on. So you see these unregulated data flows are badly traceable, super error prone, produce silos, redundancies, and breaks super easy. If your colleague from sales goes on holidays, do you just stop making reports? Or do you ask somebody else who's then digging into a colleague's emails? It's all messy. But at the same time, these undocumented data flows tell you something very important. They tell you how data in your organization would need to flow in an ideal scenario. They show you a need. So now you might be wondering, that's all nice and well, but how do I figure this out? And the unfortunate truth of it is shoe leather. There is no easy way to getting all of this stuff sorted out beside talking to people, which can be quite uncomfortable at times. That's the second point on the slide. You need a neutral view to get an idea who is guarding which silo. And depending on how, what's the polite way to put this? Depending on how passionate they're guarding their silo, this can become quite unpleasant. But if you are going through all of this hassle, what you are left with in the end is a great starting point, which basically tells you where you can create a lot of value with relatively easy data operations measures. So you got to prioritize and choose accessible and highly valuable projects to your organization, and then make sure you're not creating lighthouses. Keep in mind, it's never about just creating a notebook, which will then be archived away once the presentation is held. Try to create infrastructure. And this has been quite abstract so far. So let's walk through 2 projects we've been having recently. And we're going to start with example 1, where we're developing an AI application to improve planning processes. We were having a customer, and they were in the space of planning large multi-year projects. And the problem is that staffing these long-running projects is relatively complex. If a project runs for more than a decade, you got to hire people. You got to make sure you have the right people for each project phase. And getting it wrong can delay these projects and cost millions. So there is a real need to solve this issue. At the same time, what they were doing is every project planner took care of each project individually and came up with numbers. Controlling said, sounds about right, probably, or was asking questions back, but it was all based on individual experience. So we set out to provide an application providing a reliable baseline estimate. So we didn't want to automate this process, but rather leave enough space for planners to adjust it up and down, but take away the work of doing it all from scratch every time and just leave them with an up and down adjustment in the end. So just remove the redundancies, but still allow for individual expertise. So we started working with the customer. And this approach has the key advantages if you're going for a high value application in the beginning, that you're creating immediate value. This can help you to get skeptical actors on board because you're immediately showing, okay, if we're transitioning away from silos, we're actually creating something that will benefit everyone in the organization, not only in the very long run, but already in the medium term. Also, if you get started with a specific application in mind instead of just doing broad architectural thinking, you will run into issues that you didn't see coming, which is very valuable in its own right. because it tells you even more about your organization's data. That's what I put down here on the slide as the last point. It can serve as a crystallization point for future improvements. An example. We got started with our application in this instance. We achieved good first results, and we thought, hey, just add more data. Let's improve this. Let's make this really great. However, we soon ran into a couple of data problems, including an encrypted file without access key. The only person who ever knew that access key recently retired, which was a little bit unfortunate. So we had to figure out a way around this. We worked with an orphan data warehouse, so we could only take data out of it, but nobody knew how to add data into it. And important data sources were not integrated. And especially stuff like the Excel files, you only really ever notice if you start building an application. Just from theoretical planning, you will not get there. Talking about integration, this brings us to the second example. And this example highlights that you need to tailor what you want to do in terms of data operations specifically to your use case. In this case, we had a customer with strong data silos, plenty of expertise in each department. Everybody's super competent. Just the communication between the different departments in terms of data was severely lacking. And we tried to solve this problem by implementing a data mesh to keep the data in the hands of the local experts, but at the same time create reliable access throughout the organization. So we eliminated need for informal data flows. And if we replace informal data flows, we need formal data flows. So we set up a bunch of ETL pipelines to automate the data movement from the data within the department to the provided API outwards facing. We implemented some data quality management measures like automatic data validation and contractually defined standards. And these helped us to create trust between the different departments. So you don't have to check every time you're in contact with your other department. Did they give us the right thing? Does it have the right format? No, you can just develop. You know what you get from the API. And this alone already alleviates a lot of inefficiencies. We did all of this Dockerized, deployed on MS Azure. For the obvious reason, we wanted to have great scaling in the future. We deployed Terraform to keep the cloud configuration reproducibly versioned, just to make sure that we know which software version goes with which infrastructure version. And doing all of this, we were still hyperscaler independent, which is really cool because we implemented it all using open source software, not relying on proprietary services by the cloud vendor. So if our customer ever says, let's move this from Azure to Google, I'm not saying it's not a lot of work, but it can be done, which is really cool, I think. That's it from my part. In case you're having any questions, I'm here. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we have time for questions.
Ah.